Good afternoon and welcome to the TalentReach hosted virtual event, the State of Venture Capital and the Great Acceleration. My name is David Obelts and I am a co-founder of the Badon Hill Group, a marketing agency that makes big business marketing available to everyone. And I'm going to be your facilitator today. Here are some tips for the best experience. The quality of the webinar is only as good as the worst connection between you and us. You can resolve most connection and quality issues by simply exiting the webinar and rejoining in. I would also like to remind you that this webinar is being recorded today and will be available on demand later this week. If you were among our first 100 registrants, you were receiving a digital copy of The Paradox of Choice by Barry Schwartz. Our panelists recommended The Paradox of Choice to be on your early 2021 reading list. To receive your copy, you're going to need to attend using the Zoom client. That way we can validate that you're actually here. You'll receive a code and email next week. We'll be taking questions from our panelists at a Q&A session at the end of the discussion. You can submit your questions in the group chat, which we'll be monitoring, or you can send an email to webinar.questions@badonhillgroup.com. That email one more time, webinar.questions@badonhillgroup.com. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce you to Kellan of TalentReach.
Thank you, David, and welcome. We at TalentReach are excited to host the newest addition to our webinar series and welcome everyone to today's discussion on the state of venture capital and embracing the Great Acceleration. Over the last several months, it has been a pleasure to help bring our community together for insightful discussions on topics that have challenged how we think and operate as businesses. And today's conversation will be just as impactful. But as we close out what has been a tough 2020 for many, we wanted to take a moment to relay our best wishes to you and your families. And we hope to see everyone in a brighter new year. TalentReach is thriving, and we will be here for you in 2021. So keep an eye out for our upcoming events being announced in January, like our new webinar series and career fair. But until then, take care, enjoy the holiday season, and know that we're looking forward to supporting recruiting when you return. Now, without further ado, I'd like to hand things off to our friend and moderator, your favorite Root Sports and Seahawks journalist, Jen Mueller. Jen, please take it away.
Oh, thank you, Helen. I have been looking forward to this conversation for quite a while, and it is partly because of the response we've gotten from the attendees, and of course, because of the panelists that we get to talk to today. This conversation should help us all accelerate success in 2021 by looking back at what we've learned and how businesses have adapted during a really interesting year. Our experts today will share how they have approached 2020 and best practices that they have developed in growing networks and maintaining existing relationships in virtual environments. They will reveal ways to build resiliency into business models that support stability and growth in a new decade, and the business and growth opportunities that they see in 2021. Now, I'm going to guide the conversation for the first 45 minutes, and then we will open it up to audience questions. I suspect that the intro part of this conversation will be a lot of broad brush topics, and that you might have more specifics that you would like the panel to address. Just pop those questions into the chat. If something happens to work with the topic we're already discussing, I will work that into the conversation. Otherwise, just know we'll look to get to as many of those as we can following the group discussion. And with that, let's introduce the panel that you will be hearing from today, starting with Kellan Carter. He is a founding managing partner of Fuse Venture Partners. That is a $100 million and more early stage software fund. He has over 10 years of software experience, including becoming the youngest partner ever at Ignition Partners. And you can see the companies that he has led investments in. Mike Fridgen is the managing director of Madrona Venture Labs. He possesses 20 years of experience in early stage company building and operating. He is also a board member and advisor of several Seattle area tech startups. He's got a different point of view that he brings to the conversation. We're so excited to hear from Mike. Our next panelist is Heather Redman. She is the co-founder and managing partner of Flying Fish Partners, a venture firm investing in artificial intelligence, machine learning, and robotics companies. She serves on a number of boards. She has been named Director of the Year, a Woman of Valor, and a Woman of Influence. She serves as the chair of the Washington Technology Industry Association. And finally, James Newell rounds out our panel. He is a partner at Voyager Capital and has worked on high growth technology companies as an advisor and investor since 2005. James earned a double degree from the University of Washington, so all you dogs out there, go dogs, where he was a first team Pac-10 All-American football player. He also earned his MBA from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. So welcome to all of our panelists today. I know that if we were in person, you would be getting a healthy round of applause. And I also know that people would want to get to know you just a little bit better. So in order to do that, before we jump into the real meat of the conversation, how about this? I'm going to have each one of you answer this question. What is the treat that you only allow yourself this time of year? Okay, what is the treat you only allow yourself this time of year? Mike, you get to start us off. What is it for you?
All right. Well, hey, first I'm going to say thanks to TalentReach for including me with this group. It's really cool to be involved with this. So for treat, I'm thinking holidays, I'm thinking Christmas morning. You got to start off with a Bailey's and coffee. I mean, that's how we're going to get the day going. And then we're going to wrap up with mom's homemade apple pie. And I am an a la mode guy, so I'm going with the a la mode to top it off. So
okay.
That's where we're at.
I like how you starting in today. James, how about you?
Also, thank you for having us. It's what, December 9th? So I have eggnog coursing through my veins. My blood type is eggnog at this point. I love it, but I don't even know if you can buy it in June. Like if it's even in the store, I've never checked. But this time of year, I'm hitting the eggnog every day. Eggnog latte, maybe. It's a daily habit.
Wow, that is hardcore. I work with a few folks like that, and yes, they would like eggnog year round, and I just think that might be taking it a little too far. But that is a very interesting fact about you, James. Kellan, how about you?
I'd like also to echo James and Mike for thanking you folks for having us on this call. I'm a glutton for chocolate, peanut butter, puppy chow, and Muddy Buddies. And then I immediately am one of those people that purchased a gym membership in January, then stopped going by February.
For those of you on the call who don't know what that is, it's Chex Mix that is dessert flavored, right? Just because I know that's something that I make, but some people might have not heard of puppy chow and wondering what exactly it is that you're doing at home there, Kellan.
Yeah.
So I highly recommend it. Heather, how about you? What's the treat that you only allow yourself this time of year?
Well, I am very permissive with myself. So basically I don't have any rules ever about anything. So the allowing is maybe a stretch in my case, but I'm definitely on Team James with the eggnog. I have not purchased any yet this year because I'm in Palm Springs and I have no idea where to get anything, but I need to get on that. And we'll definitely be putting whatever alcohol is available in it, at least for the evening eggnog course.
For the evening eggnog course, I like this. We have multiple courses of eggnog that can happen during the course of the day. Well, as much fun as it is to look at this time of year and the holidays and everything that goes with it, it is also the time of year where we recap what's happened up to this point in 2020. And if you haven't already started to do 2021 planning, I'm sure that there's a lot of folks that are finishing that up in the next couple of weeks. So how about if we do this and we just take a look at the state of Seattle tech in general this year? Heather, on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate the strength of Seattle tech?
Yeah, I mean, I guess we're grading on a curve a little bit. You know, there's no question that everything is a little topsy-turvy right now, but I would say in terms of where we are relative to our peer cities worldwide, we are in excellent shape. We have been for a very long time. It's hard for us to recognize it, and often hard for us to get others to understand where we are, just because we're not really a marketing centric town and never have been. But I think we're very well positioned. We continue to have great anchors here in terms of large companies that are hugely significant in the world and attracting a lot of talent, and new companies growing here, but also showing up from other jurisdictions, all day long. It's interesting how, Texas is getting a lot of headlines right now for attracting corporate headquarters and talent out of the Bay Area. But I think we are going to be in an excellent position to continue to do that as well. UW continues to move up the ranks in terms of its ability to turn out great graduates, and our overall ecosystem and ethos around creating companies, which is really the DNA of Seattle, I think just continues to be very present here. Our economy is dominantly tech. So just as an economic base, we're in very good shape because tech has fared so well in COVID. So I couldn't be more bullish on our prospects, notwithstanding that we all have collectively around the world a lot to recover from.
Yeah. Mike, what do you know to be true about the tech market in Seattle?
Sure, and I'm really with Heather on this. I mean, I think it's hard to imagine a better place to build a technology company than in Seattle. It's really a top market for talent. We have the highest concentration of engineers with top 25 CS degrees. We're also a top market for brain gain over brain drain. We do an incredible job of retaining tech talent. And, as Heather said, our anchors help. We have two of the most valuable companies in the world in our backyard, worth over $1 trillion each. They continue to grow. But not just those companies, we also have 100 plus satellite offices, Google, Facebook, Apple, go down the list. They're here and they're growing. So we have great talent, but it's not just that. We also have incredible results. If you look at the last 5 years, we've had 18 companies reach $1 billion plus valuation. And that's not including multiple $1 billion ideas and products that have been spun out of Microsoft and Amazon during that same time. So I'm bullish. I think we're in a good spot, as Heather said. And I think you're also this point about Texas and Austin. I mean, as tech's fleeing San Francisco, it's not just the talent, it's also companies. We just added a cybersecurity company that's relocated completely over here. So, we continue to see a strong growth.
Kellan, how would you describe your year after kicking off your fund in March?
Strange would be the only word to describe it. And it sounds like Heather and Mike just read slides 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 in our pitch deck in that journey. But just like we preached to all of our portfolio companies, you got to adjust with whatever hand you're dealt with. And rather than go to traditional institutions that were taking stock of their existing commitments, their existing portfolios, we needed to adjust and go where the money was, and adjust the story, adjust the focus, and pivot. And we a lot of learnings along the way, but I think exactly what Heather and Mike just said. There's a lot of excitement around this ecosystem, a tremendous bench of talent, second to none in the world, and really a dearth of capital. And so it's been a strange year, but just like a lot of our companies, we've adjusted, and we think we're set up to endure the economic expansion at the back end of this.
James, as an investor, where have you seen the greatest acceleration?
Well, this is a weird period. We're not sitting in a room together, talking, shaking hands, breathing on each other. None of those things are happening right now. And we've just seen completely new behaviors as consumers and completely new behaviors in the way that we work. And so we still have the same needs. We have many of the same wants, but need to achieve those goals with different behaviors. And so everything around enabling work from home, communication, collaboration is just red hot. Everybody's focused on it and paying attention to it, at least on the B2B side where we spend most of our time. And then on the consumer side, how are you going to do your Christmas shopping this year, Jen? Probably online. You're probably not going into a whole lot of stores. And so you're seeing some real secular tailwinds around that, because we still need to achieve those goals, but we can't get there using the same behaviors, habits that we did in the past. And that's creating some real winners and some real potential losers in various categories in both B2B and consumer.
James, you are correct. I will be doing most of my Christmas shopping online. I will also be doing it with a glass of wine in hand. So there could be some very good things. There could be some huge surprises that show up at my door. Who knows what happens with my Christmas shopping this year? There was an article that was just written in the New York Times that was republished in the Seattle Times talking about how the startup space is insanity right now. They were detailing the frenzy. I think they were really focused on San Francisco, but it is with investors and startups just kind of in this environment, taking advantage of exactly what all the panelists have just said. Mike, you and I had a conversation about why a recession is a good time to start a business. I know that we are seeing people do that, but can you detail why that makes sense right now?
Sure. I think there's several reasons. I'll highlight three. I mean, first is talent. Founding a company is not for the faint of heart, and especially in a downturn. It's tough to leave a comfy, cushy job at a big tech company. But what is if someone takes that leap of faith to build a company, they're serious, they're driven, they're passionate about solving the problem. And there are just a lot fewer entrepreneurs in the mix. It's just more difficult to make the leap. So I find that the quality of the talent is actually higher in moments like this. The second thing I'd key on is opportunity. As James was just saying, I mean, times like this, we have a lot of behavioral change. We're forced into it out of necessity. You kind of harken back to 07, 09 when Airbnb was just getting going. That was a moment where people are looking to, get an extra buck renting out a room, and people are looking for a lower price for lodging. I mean, today that company's preparing to go public. It'll probably be over 40 billion. I mean, the largest hotel is Hilton at just over 10 billion. To put that in perspective, that's mind blowing. So here's a company that started in a recession, in a downturn, and completely reshaped the whole space of lodging. The third, I'd say, is competition. There's just fewer competitors. Incumbents are retrenching. It's a great time as a founding team to focus on your product, focus on your customer, hit product market fit. And then, 2-3 years down the line, the market comes roaring back and you're well positioned. You're well positioned to grow as demand increases. So those are the key three things in my mind.
But it's not just that, right? So there's a lot of opportunity there, but James, there's also a few things that founders need to keep in mind, because when you are in this virtual space, and as you pointed out, you're not breathing on each other, which is kind of an odd way to think about it. And that's all we've been doing for all of time leading up to this, right? There are some challenges that founding teams need to be aware of. What are those?
Well, you need to build and scale a team differently, and as investors, we often see repeat founders, people who've been in high growth startups and environments, and they can apply those lessons into building and scaling their next company. There's very, very, very few successful examples of entirely remote teams being built up and having a successful outcome. And so, I think everybody who manages a portfolio of investments, I think we were all probably pleasantly surprised by how easily our teams were able to shift from, hey, we all went in and commuted to our office and we worked, and then the next day we decided we weren't going to do that anymore, and we all got on Slack and everybody got their Zoom account updated, and we're pretty much good. Productivity hasn't gone down in a really meaningful way. And so I think that it feels to me like the prevailing narrative right now is, hey, work from home is easy. It works in tech. This isn't a problem. But I'd caution people against drawing that conclusion that moving an existing team with culture, with norms, with a social fabric, social connection, and moving that existing team into a remote environment is very, very different from building that initial remote team and building a culture around it, and being able to build mentorship networks within within a company. We're a lot of my companies are obviously hiring again, and frankly, many of them were through the downturn. But if you're hiring a recent college graduate right now, the person who's going to be benefiting the most from that physical proximity, that mentorship connection, that's going to be really, really challenging to bring those people along. So you can add in senior dev, but can you hire 10 new college graduates if nobody's there to help them along?
Yeah, that is going to be interesting to see how the people part of this goes. Heather, I've got a question for you. I do want to acknowledge that Mike, I see your question. Patrick, I see your question. We will work that in just a little bit. So Heather, to the point that James is making, where you aren't sitting face to face with each other anymore, why do you say that it is important to have the right listeners in the room, whatever that room is, whether it's in person or in a virtual space, to help overcome some of that culture building challenge?
Yeah, I do think intentionality is super important right now. And I wanted to just comment on one thing that James said before we launch into that conversation, which is, I'm sure everybody else on the panel is seeing this too, but I'm seeing a lot of companies that are addressing exactly the problems that James just identified. So it's funny, it's the changes in behavior that we're talking about being beneficial as disruptors to allowing new companies to start include the things that are internal to companies being successful. So we're seeing a lot of future of work startups, we're seeing a lot of productivity startups, we're seeing things to address some of these culture challenges. And then you layer on top of that some of the topic that I think you're bringing up now, which is that we've also had a lot of disruption on the social side as well. So we've had Black Lives Matter, and we have a lot of social issues that are kind of coming to the fore and being dealt with, and a lot of division in our country, and a lot of issues about, are we globalists, are we not? And all of those give rise to opportunities for new technology enabled solutions, right? So it's very interesting to kind of see how that lines up. But one of the things we've done at Flying Fish is we've put a lot of emphasis on diversity, and diversity in the biggest sense of the word. So not just racial and gender diversity, but also diversity of backgrounds. And so one of the stories that Jen and I geeked out on a little bit when we were talking was, we have a lot of technical founders, as do most of us, in our portfolio. And we had something happen at Flying Fish recently where I was the lead on a company, and I was working with them a lot, and I think I have a tremendous EQ and sort of pride myself on being able to work well with people. But I didn't realize sort of what the mental state of one of our founders was. And as soon as I got my partners, Frank and Jeff, in the room, who are deeply technical engineering types, they immediately spotted something that they have seen over and over in their career, which was that this particular highly technical founder was pretty miserable. And I hadn't picked up on that. And so to me, it was a great sort of non-typical example of why diversity matters, which is having that right person in the room, getting the feedback and reading the cues, which are often nonverbal, often harder to read in a virtual environment, in order to pick up on what's going on with the team and how best to help and mentor that team. And this is a challenge that we are all facing, and Kellan, I think, alluded to it a little bit with institutional investors on, upstream of us. It's harder to understand a team remotely. And so the cultural issues that James identified, some of the, sort of chaos that we're all experiencing in choosing companies and having investors choose us, the whole, sort of cycle of life of money here, those are all more acute right now with less sort of in-person cues to read. And so you have to be just doubly intentional about gathering the data around teams, around people. And that's a lot more work for everybody. Yeah. But it also requires a lot of diversity on your team to do it really well.
Yeah. And that is actually going to lead into a question Maureen had. Maureen, I'm going to get to this question about kind of what does that mean for what your portfolio looks like now, right? So I want everybody to think about that as far as, are you looking at different companies now than you would have a year ago? Is it based on geography? Is it based on, need, kind of what the problem is that they're solving? But just be thinking about that, because I do think that goes into how you evaluate founders and teams and what that looks like now compared to even a year ago. But I want to get Kellan on this, because look, we can be bullish and we can be optimistic on a lot of things, but there's also a reality that we need to face, and uncertainty is going to be there. What does honesty have to do with uncertainty and the way that you communicate that to your team and then to the folks that you're investing with?
I think the last 12 years, you've just seen the funds get bigger. I mean, there was a $100 billion venture capital fund raised. And that just exacerbates already what can be perverse incentives among investors, reckless spending, and companies getting just so dang fat with nice to haves and not the need to haves. And I think as COVID reality was setting in, it really forced companies to take stock of what was really working versus what wasn't working and really be honest about it. It's so easy to say, this couldn't happen to me, this couldn't happen to me, but being really quickly adapting, being honest with what is working and what isn't, and then focusing and doubling down on what is working. We always say here at Fuse that focus is the best asset that doesn't show up on your balance sheet. And so that meant having harder conversations with founders, harder conversations with the non-performing members of the team, cutting office space so you can focus on the human capital and preserve runway for human capital. It really was an honesty check on what are the hard conversations that I've been avoiding and how do I address them now so I can persevere for however long this uncertainty may last. And I think for the companies in our portfolio that did that and did that intentionally, they're already coming out of this much better off than they came in potentially.
Well, and when you talk about focus, Mike, this is part of a conversation about building resiliency into any business, whether you had intended to or not, it needs to be there. How are you seeing companies account for that?
Yeah, I just pick up on Kellan's point about nice to have versus need to haves. I mean, I think, job number one for a CEO is keep money in the bank. And in times like these, you need to be disciplined and you need to make really hard decisions around non-performing team members, as Kellan said. Hard decisions about your roadmap. There's 10 things you want to do, maybe pick 2 or 1 or 2. I mean, really be focused. And that's, I think, going to put you in a position to really extend runway, nail your product, your customer solution, and put you in a position to have future success.
Well, and when you talk about people starting things this year and all the opportunity, how can any startup maximize their chance to succeed right now? In addition to taking advantage of the talent and building in runway, what else do founders need to make sure they have?
Yeah, I mean, I really go back to the runway point is so important. I mean, it's back to being job number one, but it's just something that having the discipline to make these hard decisions can make or break the company. And just having the right partners around the table, board, advisors, people on the team, where you trust their judgment, having those conversations ahead of the curve before you're really in a desperate mode is important. So I think these are the types of conversations early stage companies certainly should be having.
James, I'm going to throw this question to you. This comes from Jason Young, who put this in the chat. How has the board's role changed or shifted to better support their portfolio companies? So do you have any thoughts on how that relationship and dynamic has changed?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'm not sure that I'll ever have another year where I check in on the mental health of founders as much as this one. There's certainly a blending of a personal relationship and a professional relationship between board members and their founders and executives. And I don't think that that's ever been in as great a focus as this year, because these are trying times, and understanding what is happening in people's personal lives around everything that's happening in the world, whether it be the pandemic, a national conversation and reckoning around our race relations. This is their childcare situation. That's been super challenging for me this year. Having 2 toddlers in the house while I'm trying to work full time. Notice these huge headphones that can block out sound coming from outside the room. These are things that that are now a board level conversation. How is the team? How is morale? How are we shifting into this work from home environment? Does everybody have a space that they can be comfortable in and productive in? I don't remember having those kinds of conversations to the same degree in prior years. But now you need to have that conversation, in every board meeting, just to check in on how people are doing during this time.
Yeah, I think that it's important to remember we're all human, right? And this period in time really brings that home, I think, more than just day to day as it was prior to 2020. Heather, I'm going to get to you in just a minute, but Kellan, I want to, if people are not familiar with Fuse, so you and I have a mutual connection and a common friend. You work with Seahawks linebacker Bobby Wagner. He is part of the team. And I think for those people who know that, there's probably a little bit of, envy and jealousy, right? Because you get to talk Seahawks football with him probably whenever you want to, right? But it also would appear that perhaps that accelerates the growth of a company. But it's not just bringing on somebody with a big name or a celebrity or somebody that's kind of endorsing. What should people know about entering that type of a relationship as they are growing a fund, a company, or starting one?
Well, it was either he joined us or I joined the Seahawks, and no fans of the Hawks wanted that. And so we opted for him to join us. But Bobby has been working with us in an informal way for over 3 years now. And one of the things that was really clear with him that we love in both Fuse team members, but also the entrepreneurs that we back, highly curious people. I would argue that there's probably not another middle linebacker in the league right now that's reading an accounting book on the weekend. Bobby does those types of things. He was also very intentional in building out his set of personal advisors, whether it's John Connors here or some of the Costco founders. The guy is very aggressive and intentional about building out his personal set of advisors. And so when it came time to formalize the relationship, we knew he'd be a perfect fit. He's a winner. He's a guy of high integrity, and he adds a ton of value day in and day off. I do love talking Seahawks football with him. Usually I used to not be a fan, but he's turned me into a fan, and I'm a believer the more I get to know him. And so we're lucky we get to work with him. He's been an incredibly valued member of the team, and we're go Hawks. I know I'm going to catch a lot of crap for saying that from all my friends now if they see this.
Well, James is giving you crap right now by messaging me in the chat, asking why the Seahawks defense is not performing at the standards that Bobby has set. And here's, James, what I'm going to tell you. In the last 4 weeks, the Seahawks defense is allowing less than 20 points a game. That is a big turnaround from the first few weeks of the season. So there is reason for optimism on the Seahawks defense. As for anything else, I still have to go to press conferences this week, so I'm not giving you any more comments on the Seahawks. But Kellan, when you talk about intentionality, Heather, that comes back around to this other part. And you've said that word before, right? And when you're trying to build and maintain relationships, you have to be very intentional. So 2 questions here. What do you mean by intentional extroverts, right? And what happens if you're not? How do you make up for it? And then the other way is, can you give us an example of how you've been intentional with networking and asking for referrals?
Yeah, so I think one of the really interesting things that somebody taught me was that there are extroverts and there are introverts, but the real killers out there are the intentional extroverts. So they're basically introverts who've decided to be extroverts. And I am married to a true extrovert. My husband is, we once were sitting in our house and he saw like somebody in the distance, and James will like this because this was like in the deep part of West Seattle. Saw somebody in the distance, like outside our window, like up, a block away. And he was like, oh, there's a person, they might need something, and went running out the door. And I'm like, you are so weird. Who would ever do that? But that's the kind of thing that extroverts do. They are so people oriented that they will just glom onto people wherever they are in any circumstance. I'm an introvert, but I am a trained extrovert, basically. And what that means is that I have a filter. So I decide who I want to expose myself to, but then I go after those people very intentionally. And I think for a VC, being an intentional extrovert and a trained extrovert is probably the killer skill set. But I would say really for anybody who believes that people are part of their job. And COVID has put a real damper on that because, as James has now infamously said, we don't get to breathe on other people. So we got to figure out a different way to do it, right? And so what I have found is that I am attending a lot of Zoom events with the idea of meeting new people. So I'm not attending them just to keep track of my existing network, although I do a lot of that in the sidebar chat, but also reaching out to people who look interesting to me who are at the same event and setting up coffees with them, again, virtually after the fact. So I had 2 of those already this morning. 2 fabulous people, somebody very senior in HR circles who's now become a CEO of a public company, and somebody who runs an accelerator that is a specialist in the healthcare field. Totally mind expanding for me in both cases, and great people for not only deal flow, but also to bounce ideas off of when we see things in a particular industry that pitch us, in a startup. We need to know people who actually know what they're talking about. Unlike us, we're sort of the ultimate generalists. So it's, I think there are a lot of interesting hacks that people are using right now, but you have to really continue to work hard to expose yourself to newness in this environment. And I think it's a way to kind of get through it too.
Well, and you had said when you are reaching out to people and you ask for kind of the referral, it's not just the, hey, you looked interesting, but you had a line about, hey, it looks like you're an expert in this field. Could you introduce me to somebody, right? How did that go again?
Your guess is as good as mine, but yeah, I think it's always trying to have one thing lead to another. So it's really not stopping just with that conversation, but always having some kind of follow up as well. Which once you have kind of a lot of stuff going on, which I always try to keep a lot of plates spinning, it's very natural to have one thing layer onto another thing and to be able to help people really rapidly, just because you know somebody that's going to be useful to them. So for me, I'm most often giving as opposed to asking, just because I find that I'm in a position to do that. But it's amazing how that then ultimately will turn around to be something that benefits us and what we're doing on the portfolio side.
Yeah. And I think that was really the big thing, right? Be intentional with what you're asking for, what you are offering, so that it's not just, hey, I'm checking in. Hey, I haven't talked to you in a while, right? Nobody gets super excited about that email. Give me a hook that makes me want to respond. Seahawks defense is going to work a lot with Kellan and James. I have a feeling James is going to be like, maybe not. That's fine. Hey, Mike and James, I'm going to tee you up in just a minute to give us companies that you are excited about in 2021. We are almost to the point where we are going to start taking those audience questions. So if you have not already put the question that you have in the chat, go ahead and do so. I know we've got a pretty long queue that's going, but Kellan, building off of what Heather just said, like if you are trying to network with people and you feel like you are at a disadvantage right now because you can't have these serendipitous meetings in a hallway, at a coffee shop, at a networking event, you pointed out a couple of things that I thought are good for everybody to remember. The opportunity here is when people aren't traveling, there's a better opportunity to get time with them on your calendar. And also you ask for referrals after you make these connections so that you can keep building this network. How does this all work?
So fundraising, just like enterprise sales, generally requires many, many in-person meetings, sometimes playing golf, dinner, drinks, all the schmoozing that you can imagine. Well, we didn't have that luxury over the last 9 months, and the world kept turning. And so what are we going to do? Had to learn how to pitch Fuse over Zoom. And every time we'd get an order, we were a little bit shameless and we'd say, all right, who else do you know? There's going to be a draft email in your inbox for all you have to do is click forward. And we're hoping to get 5 more intros out of you. And it's pretty hard to say no to if you do the work. You do the work for them, so all they have to do is click forward. And that's how we really started to get the flywheel going with the fundraise. So not doing in-person meetings and using existing commitments to then access their networks. And really what it came down to is if someone's going to take the meeting and they're taking a referral from a meeting, they're likely going to do something because otherwise they wouldn't waste the time. So going the extra mile, doing the work, then asking for the referral with the positioning statement in their inbox, that really worked well for us in the long run. So that's how we ended up getting over $100 million raised.
I love it. Mike, I see you nodding your head. What do you love about that approach that Kellan just laid out?
I just like the fact that he's got a founder's mindset as a VC. I mean, that's right. I mean, he's hustling. That's exactly what successful founders do. So that's what I was responding to.
Oh, very good. Well, speaking of those founders, everything that we've talked about, it kind of helps you think about what you should focus on in 2021, just from the people side of things, right? How are you cultivating those relationships? What do you need to be considering in those relationships? But also, there are companies that have been started that are addressing some of the very real and somewhat new issues that we've all encountered in 2020. So I'm going to have each one of our panelists identify a company that they are excited about going into 2021. Now, you might not have heard of these companies. You might be hearing a lot about these companies in coming months. Then we're going to get some final takeaways from the panelists, and then we are going to get to some audience questions. So, Mike, give me an opportunity that you see in 2021 and a company that we should be looking for.
Well, I'm glad I get to go first because I'm going to pick the obvious and massive one, and that's the future of work as a theme. We're all living this global work from home experiment, and two companies that really pop for me in this. One, we're partnering with James at Voyager on. It's called UpLevel. It's helping engineers be more productive at work. And I think it's just, really hitting a tailwind with what's happening in our world right now. And a second, I'm going to call out Heather at Flying Fish. We're partnering on a company called Vouched. And there's a real acceleration shift on digital. You think telehealth and e-commerce. And that's another business that's really flourishing with digital ID verification and providing solutions to these companies. So I'll point to those two. But I think in general, products that give employees their time back, help them be more effective. We're going to see a lot of shifts of these corporate lease budgets to productivity. And I think these types of opportunities really, again, this shift in behavioral change, there'll be some really exciting opportunities there.
All right, James, add on to what Mike just said.
Yeah, I think that I think there's a company in Seattle called Syndio, and it has the potential to be the most important company to come out of Seattle during this cohort. And they do pay equity analysis. So really trying to answer this question of how do we treat our employees? How do we pay them? Do we pay them fairly? And obviously we're in sort of the unfortunate circumstances of reckoning with a very long history, a very challenging history around those questions. And we've had a period over the last 6 to 9 months where every large employer is coming out and saying, we're going to do better. We're going to be part of the solution. And yet actually has basically zero ability to bring data to that conversation and even answer their own questions about how they pay and treat employees. And that's really where Syndio is focused. They've been doing really well lately, based here in Seattle. And I think that this is going to be a really, really important company. And one that you'll all be hearing a lot about in the coming years.
Okay, Kellan, what do you think? What's a company that we should be looking for?
I just made a note. I'm feeling a little neglected by Mike, given he's working with Heather and James. And so made a goal for 2021 to rectify that. But one of the companies that we're really excited about I guess semi-confidentially now that I'm broadcasting this to this audience, is a company called Pave here locally in Seattle that builds time and earnings optimization tools for gig workers. So they can make as much money per hour of the day per job that they do across all the gig platforms. We keep reading about all these blockbuster IPOs, whether it's Uber, Lyft, DoorDash recently. This is a way for the people that are actually doing the work to make more money and participate in the economic gains that those companies are creating.
All right, I like it. Heather, what's the company that you think we should be looking for?
Oh gosh, there's so many to choose from. We've got a bunch of stuff in sort of the future of work category that Mike highlighted. So, definitely think Reclaim.ai out of Portland is a super interesting one. And they're, really, I always say they're making your calendar fight with you. So you kind of tell your calendar what you want and in terms of like, what do you actually want to accomplish? And then they sort of fight with you with AI to make sure you don't screw up your life, which I personally need. So that's a good one. But one that's always a crowd pleaser is a company called Picnic, which is our pizza making robots company. And they are really interesting in this era of COVID because people are recognizing that you don't need to have humans do everything, that, things like food prep, which can be done very efficiently in a cooler, can be done by robots, but not humans, because humans don't want to be in a cooler all day long. And right now they can't be next to each other all day long. So Picnic is a really exciting one, and also has a lot of environmental benefits as well, because you don't have the waste. Food waste is a huge problem. And when a robot is making the food, they make it the same way every time, and you can plan your inventory very, very well as a result. So that's another one that, certainly we should all eat more pizza. So look for Picnic.
Right. That's what my COVID weight needs. Yep. It needs more pizza. Thanks, Heather. As long as it comes with a healthy dose of wine, I guess that's probably okay. I can handle that
Little
one.
eggnog, little pizza. It's all good.
Yeah. And then we are all joining the gyms in 2021. Okay, before we get to the audience questions, which I can see there are still more rolling in, so I want to leave plenty of time for that. Here's what I would like to do. I'd like each panelist to give us their kind of final thoughts. Just they're going to sum up what they want you to take away today and think about in about 90 seconds. James, it's going to go James, Heather, Kellan, and Mike. So James, why don't you lead us off here?
Building on what we talked about earlier about this idea of massive behavior changes and needing to work differently and consume things differently, there's going to be some false positives in terms of what we think are permanent behaviors versus what we think are temporary. And so beware of false positives. There are going to be people who want to return to work and work from an office. I'm one of them. Now I live in West Seattle, so I can't physically get to my office anyway, but I want to be back there. I miss people, which maybe does make me an extrovert. And so we look at a lot of companies and we wonder, like, hey, is this somebody who has product market fit, or do they have pandemic market fit? And if you are, buying DoorDash at $200 a share today, you should be asking yourself that question of whether that is true product market fit. And that's a permanent behavioral change. Next is, maybe in some ways building on what I said about Syndio. You can make good technology while also making technology a good industry, an industry that is a force for good. And I think that, maybe a lot of people in my sort of age demographic who've been in and around this industry for some period of time are right now sort of thinking for the first time about, like, wait, are we the baddies? Like, we're in tech, we're always the good guys, right? And I think that as an industry, we now need to take a more thoughtful approach. Move fast and break things. It looks good on a wall, it looks great on a t-shirt, but maybe we do need to be thoughtful about what we're potentially breaking and where and how we're applying technology. And it is raising some of these ethical questions that we need to be very thoughtful about, particularly as it relates to AI, misinformation, like all these different categories that you're going to see, Congress gets spun up on in the next 4, 8, 12, 20 years. And these are important questions. And finally, make sure you leave room for optimism. This sort of feels like a dark, heavy time, especially around the holidays, given, we're not seeing our families, we're not doing the same activities that maybe we've been doing, traditions are breaking, but leave yourself room for optimism. This is going to pass. We're going to return to, I don't know if it's the old normal, but it's going to be the new normal. And I won't be doing Zoom meetings to the same extent from this empty bedroom in my house, unless the West Seattle Bridge collapses, in which case I probably will. Continue to be optimistic.
At least you've got some options there. You found a workaround if something were to happen. James, well done on that one. Heather, what would you like to make sure the audience knows today?
So I think the big, I'm an optimist for sure. Like James, I have concerns about technology, and that's actually one of the reasons that I'm in AI, is because I think people like me need to be paying attention, and so it's a good sector for me to be involved in. The shifts that we're going through are definitely major, and they create a lot of opportunity for disruption. We not only did we have a recession and are having a recession that was caused by COVID, we've also had all these behavior shifts because of COVID. And then we've also had so much change in terms of our perception of social justice issues and our desire to make changes there. So when you've got that kind of treble disruption, you're going to see a lot of acceleration of change and a lot of opportunities open up as a result. And I think that's what we're seeing. So I think my major takeaway from these points would be, whatever walk of life you're in, and I know we have a wide variety of folks on the call or on the Zoom today, get involved in tech. This is not a time to think, oh, well, that's tech, and get involved in startup. If you don't want to start one, go work for one. Your big employer will always have you back later. If you're not an investor, consider becoming an investor. If you're not sort of advising young people or old people that want to start companies, get involved in that now, because tech is really going to majorly accelerate out of this disruption, this troubled disruption. And you want to have a seat at that table if you want your life to be interesting and fulfilling over the next couple of decades.
Kellan, how about you? What are your takeaways?
Well, I had 3 things on a slide, but I'd like to go back to what James said earlier.
Name calling now. Goodness gracious, what's happening?
Exactly. That was just a passive aggressive slight right there. Checking in the mental health of founders, but not only founders, but just the people in our lives. It's just been a strange year and harder on some than we might expect. And so I just wrote a note to make sure just a great reminder to do that to the folks in my life, encourage everyone else to do the same. But we're all of us investors on this panel are here based in Seattle, based in the Pacific Northwest. This is arguably hard to argue that this is the most talented ecosystem in the world. It's the most exciting place to be. I think with the exodus in the Bay Area, it's really well positioned to even elevate its role in the world. If you are starting a company, and this has been a common theme across this panel, is every single company, whether it's software or non-software, are really reevaluating and also reinventing how they do business, with software as a key component to doing that. They want to incorporate software into the business model, or they want to take certain costs out and use software as a conduit to do that. And lastly, it's always darkest before dawn. And there is room for optimism, as James referred to earlier.
I've been confused with you around town a number of times, but I have never been confused with John. But that is a bonus. Thank you.
There's a couple of stories that James and I have actually gotten mixed up at events by people. It's pretty funny. Yeah. But it is always darkest before dawn. There's vaccines around the corner. There is room for optimism. And I think, there's a lot of hope for 2021.
I like the optimism there. Mike, bring it home with your takeaways before we get to some audience questions.
All right, I'm going to continue the optimism trend here and just start with, we've all talked about Seattle. I'll make it brief, but it's a special place. And we've kind of all won the lottery being here and doing what we do. You look at the talent, you look at tech excellence of AI and cloud and voice, et cetera, in our investor community. I think it's a great place to build a company. I think it's well positioned for growth. We talked about now being a great time. For those who are listening, who are passionate about a problem, and this is, don't hesitate. The timing can work in your favor. I think we've talked about that. And these ideas are generally unearthed because, again, necessity and new behavioral patterns and opportunities will emerge. I'm just encouraging those to take the leap forward and give it a go.
Now that you have heard from our panelists and they've given you a lot of great things to think about, I think our attendees have some questions for you. So David, I'm going to have you kind of help us moderate this part of the conversation. I know that we had a lot, so we'll probably just have one panelist answer the question just so we can get through a lot of questions here. So what do we have first, David?
The first question was pre-submitted, and this comes from Tim. For areas like travel or hospitality tech innovations, how optimistic are VCs that things will be back to normal in 2021? Part 2, are you funding post-pandemic innovations to get people together in real life, or are you still focusing on virtual solutions?
Okay, who has a good answer for that one? I can see wheels turning. Heather raises her hand. Go ahead, Heather.
I'll take it. Yeah, I do think there's a lot of interest in travel and leisure, in-person travel and leisure-related solutions coming out of the pandemic. There is a lot of pent-up demand for travel, as I think we can all attest. Even James wants to just get across the damn bridge. That would be a start. So there's certainly interest in that sector. And then I would say we aren't so much thinking about, oh, it goes back to normal, and so let's fund things for normal. We're thinking more about funding things that work for the new normal. So what is the new normal? So we wouldn't be, say, starting a new airline that was going to address the huge additional demand in business travel that didn't used to exist or something, because we think business travel is going to go down in the new normal. But we would be interested in something that addresses what is going to be a combination of needs for in-person and remote work. So I think, don't look for the return to normal, but look at what this new environment that's sort of mixed can lead to in investment opportunities.
Mike, I see that you're going to say something there.
I would even build on that. I think corporate travel, that's going to take some time to come back. And you have, empty hotels in Manhattan that need a strategy to fill. I mean, I think there's some really interesting ideas out there around on-demand workspace. So not committing to it, but using it on demand as teams require. I think some of these companies will help shape how people work in the future, frankly. But I to Heather's point, it's the reimagination versus betting on demand to come back anytime soon.
Very good. David, what's our next question?
Yes, and I know that you weaved a couple of questions in, and that was actually when our internet died and I stepped out of the studio for a moment. So if I start reading a question, Jen, that you're like, we already covered that, just jump in and say, David, we already covered that.
Okay.
We have a question from Patrick. How does raising VC differ outside Silicon Valley versus inside Silicon Valley?
James, your eyes got very big at that question.
Yeah. So I actually spent most of my career down in the Bay Area. So have been investing companies in that echo chamber and have been investing out here in the provinces, so to speak, in Seattle. And it is different because there's just a different density of investors up here. There's just very few firms. You can count them all on one hand. They're almost all on this Zoom call. In fact, if you just look at our ecosystem, and that's very different than in the Bay Area, where you go into Coop Cafe or the Creamery, a couple of years ago, and it's like, oh, hey, hey guys, yeah, we're all here to meet with the one founder over there. Okay, I'll just wait and get my tea over here. And up here, at least when I started spending time in the ecosystem, people were like, oh, how can I help you get, how can I help you get started? How can I help you get involved in the ecosystem here? Versus in the Bay Area, where it's really, capital is seen as a commodity. It's seen as, you're almost a functionary in some sense. And so that has, profound implications in terms of what it's like to fundraise, because there's a scarcity of capital, particularly at the angel and really early stages up here. And that's something that, frankly, these people here are all working to address. So it's easier to raise your first venture round if you are based in the Bay Area. But there are some pretty significant disadvantages to building and scaling a company down there. And so I think you just need to work harder to get those first dollars in the door if you're raising here versus down in the ecosystem, where there's a lot of low conviction check writers who are angel investors and just say yes after a coffee meeting. We just have fewer of those up here in Seattle.
And I'll build on that as well just a little bit, because I split time at Ignition for 6 years between Seattle and the Bay Area. And to Heather's point earlier, the marketing isn't really in Seattle's DNA, but it is in the Bay Area's DNA. The marketing and storytelling is second to none down there. And there's also an extremely excessive amount of capital. There are 10,000 versions of all of us on this call right now that are wandering the streets of South Park or Sand Hill Road looking for the next entrepreneur. And while the FOMO may be unhealthy, it sure is useful from an investor standpoint. And that's why you see the funds getting bigger and the money just chasing ideas. I think longer term, where capital isn't viewed as a commodity and viewed as a scarcity, it does allow companies to focus and get way more results per investment dollars in. And so I think you do really have that here in Seattle that can be long-term much more useful.
I just
Very
add a
good.
point that this pandemic in some respects has leveled the playing field a bit for Seattle founders, where there are less coffee shop run-ins, as James was describing. I mean, for us, for the first time in our studio, worked with founders out of the Bay Area and Los Angeles, and because there really was no advantage to being together, and we were able to go through our process with them. So I think that has changed some things to the benefit of Seattle founders.
Very good. David, what do we have next?
Yeah, our next question's from Shauna. In a lot of ways, I think part one of her question's been partially answered, but maybe if we just get which is, how have the investments they made this year look different from previous years? That's the part one. Here's the part two. What type of companies are they investing in that they wouldn't have considered 12 months ago?
Yes, and we did tee them up to think about those things. So Heather, you unmuted, and you've touched on this a little bit, right? But what do you consider now that was not on your radar earlier this year in Q1?
Well, I think, and this is not something that we have necessarily acted upon heavily yet, but I think it's something that's probably in all of our minds. There were some artificial barriers in some industries that have been forced to fall as a result of COVID. So you think about some of the innovation that we've seen in healthcare. Telemedicine was really hard to get a lot of providers to provide, or payers to pay for, or patients to use prior to COVID, but that has shifted as a result of this. Ditto with a lot of financial services where things were done in person, wet signatures, or you can only deposit a check up to X amount of money remotely. You can't do it, otherwise you got to do it in person. You got to go do a wire in person. I mean, all sorts of ridiculous barriers that have fallen just by necessity. So back to the nice to have versus must have. So I think if you look at what's happening on the digital acceleration front, you look for those industries that were resisting disruption for no good reason prior to COVID, who have now been forced into disruption because of COVID. That would be a pretty bright line switch in all of the investor behavior, because you might have stayed out of that industry before, but now that they've sort of crossed the Rubicon, so to speak, it's an open market for all of us to look at.
Interesting. Anybody else want to add on to that one about how their thoughts have changed, where they're investing, where they see opportunities?
We're investing in founders. I was just saying, we're investing in founders we've never met in person before. We have no idea how tall they are. Just not that that's an investment criteria, but we don't know what these people look like in person, only through a Zoom screen. We've never done that before. I think a very limited set of investors ever has invested like that, and it's new. This is what everybody's doing now.
Well, and in some ways that's taking away some of the biases, right? Because it really, they bring on paper.
Hopefully, but the fear is that people are only investing in network, and if you're not in that network, meaning you're a white or Asian male, that you're not going to be able to penetrate that if people are closed off, which is why it's important to continue to expand those networks, like Heather was talking about earlier.
Yeah, Mike, what did you want to add on? Oh wait.
Well, I'm now building on James's comment there. I mean, absolutely right. I think that's the challenge is, are people going to be more focused on their networks? And one of the things we're doing is we've created a future founder for diversity program where we're reaching out proactively and setting up virtual coffees and that kind of thing to build that network up, because we see this as a potential challenge and something we want to avoid. So I think that's an important point. I was also going to build on Heather's, telehealth was something that didn't come up earlier that I think is such an interesting category. That category in general is supposed to increase by 2/3 this coming year. There are a lot of interesting companies. We talked a lot about mental health challenges with our founders, but I think the population at large, they're just big opportunities to have, and back to the point of tech for good, a positive impact on society with some of these investments in companies.
Jen, I just had to chime in because what James said about how tall people are, I actually think this Zoom environment, it does have the in-network problem that you mentioned, but I actually have seen founders who don't fit the sort of the prototype of what we think of as your, kind of average founder doing well in this environment, because it does remove some of the biases, and the body language that you can see in a room that can benefit sort of the prototypical large white male is sort of removed in Zoom. And so a small person can do very well in this environment where they might not be able to do well in a physical environment. And ditto, I think we're seeing that, women who might get talked over are less likely to get talked over in this environment. There's just a lot of interesting developments here that we'll have to watch and study. And probably somebody's doing an elaborate AI study on this right now, just to see what different kinds of decisions are made out of these environments versus an in-person environment. But it is very interesting and bears intentionality for sure.
Yeah, very true. David, what do we have as our next question?
Yeah, so our next question, first of all, I wanted to do a shout out for Mike, not Mike Fridgen. Mike, your question was answered. You put it in the queue. It was answered during our panelist discussion. So we're going to move past your question, but I did want to acknowledge, Mike, that we did get your question in the queue. Maureen had a question, which was, has remote work world broadened the probabilities for VC funding? And again, I think that's something that's been touched on in the conversation, but we didn't get to the crisp yes or no.
Okay, well, we haven't heard from Kellan in a little bit. So Kellan, I'm going to have you take that question.
I missed that because James was talking crap to me.
Oh my gosh, James.
John, I mean.
Troublemaker. Goodness gracious. David, can you repeat
did it on
the
purpose,
question?
didn't you, John?
We will repeat the question.
Oh.
Has the remote world
It's all going downhill now.
I know it's all going downhill, right? We've gone over an hour. We don't do this. Has remote work world broadened the possibilities for VC funding? And again, I think we've kind of touched on it, but we didn't get to the yes or no.
I think it's accelerated certain things. If I was looking at a lot of the companies that I was involved in at Ignition and now Fuse, they have development offices outside the US, whether it's in Canada, India, Philippines. Most companies did have development offices outside their core headquarter geos. And I think potentially that those offices will move to states that generally haven't had as much technology development, like where I'm from in Montana, or middle of the country. And so I do think there is a decentralization outside of the Bay Area, especially to other areas that people want to live in more. I know you're seeing a lot of folks move to Florida. Elon Musk just moved to Texas. Palantir moved to Denver. That is only going to accelerate outside of California, I'd speculate. And hopefully Washington will be a big benefactor from that.
Very good. Next question, David.
Yeah, this is a great question by Mary Alice. It kind of ties into a lot of things that we've talked about in the last 70 minutes. How has the trifecta of healthcare, technology transformations, and social justice evolved your leadership approach?
Heather, I think you actually touched on this in some comments earlier, and how you were just making sure that you were aware of all of those things in conversations that you were having. Do you have any thoughts on how your leadership style has changed as a result?
I'm a terrible leader, so that's a bad question for me.
Wait, what? Whoa. I think we probably need to back up and just maybe qualify that statement just a little bit.
No, I try to avoid leadership at all costs. I'm a real doer, so I would be frustrated as a leader. Spencer Raskoff once said that CEO-ship is like the worst job in the world, because your job is basically to say the same thing over and over again with equal enthusiasm to every audience you have, including audience of 5 people. So to me, that communication piece and the lack of a novel idea is sort of always what I've sort of thought of when I think of leadership. But no, more seriously, I think the big thing for me that I've been wrestling with is a little bit of what James talked about, sort of how can we think more about what are we accomplishing in the world that is for the benefit of everyone, as opposed to what is my own private agenda and ambition set and all of that. And so that certainly plays into mental health, because I think that's the sort of thing that has helped all of us achieve better mental health ourselves. If you're living in your house, and not thinking about the greater good, it's really kind of hard to be motivated to get up and do your job every day, or just get up, period. So I think that, centering yourself on what's my higher calling here, in terms of why I do the job I do. And all of us are clearly big boosters of our region. So we're thinking about the people in our region. We're thinking about how tech can reach more people and create more opportunities for more people in the region, and be a better, economic steward for the region. But that sort of leadership that comes from something other than just my own, economic base and my own company, but more how am I impacting the larger world, is, I think, very motivating for all of us, and gives you a place to lead from, as opposed to, more of a selfish internal objective.
And I think it's really not only encouraged us all to not just listen, but then act. And then, listening is one thing, but acting is a totally different thing. And, an intentional plug for Fuse. We're real proud after our first hire starts mid-January. She's a total rock star. We'll be 50% owned by minority and diverse backgrounds at Fuse. And not only is that good for Fuse, but it attracts a whole different cohort of entrepreneurs of different backgrounds. And so we think that just, the beginning of something that we can be doing that will benefit founders and the Fuse platform.
Nice.
One other thing about leadership in this moment, I think, is centered at the heart around communication. Heather talked about as a CEO, Spencer saying the same thing over and over. Well, even more so now when we're not together, it's important. And I think, within our own teams, but also, with our founding teams, and driving some of these things that are, we think are high impact and high value in terms of diverse teams and other important initiatives that we have.
Yep. Communication more than ever in a virtual space and in a time of change is one of those skills we need to hone in on for sure. David, next question.
Yeah, the next question is from Nick. Nick is an inspiring investor, and he's currently an advisor to some startups. And he's asking, what can he do during the pandemic to build the skill set or resume to get into the VC space?
Not everybody all at once. Kellan, I saw you smile.
One of the things that, getting into VC partnerships are really complicated business models. And so when a VC takes on another partner or an investor that has ownership and decisioning power in a firm, it's a long relationship before you make that decision to bring somebody on. And so I'd encourage you to start spending time with the VC ecosystem, knowing that nothing will happen immediately and that it's a long-term game. And so being at the events, meeting all the partners, exchanging ideas. Before I hired Cameron Borman, who's now my co-founder of Fuse, him and I had known each other for 3 years. And we made budget to hire him because of how often we saw each other, how much I respected him. And it was just, it's a long game. And VC is known to be a long game. And so knowing you want to get into VC, don't assume it might happen tomorrow, but start building the relationships with the VC players in town or elsewhere that you are excited about potentially working with.
I think that's great advice. James, did you have something that you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, it pissed me off when Kellan hired him because I wanted to hire him. Because I'd known him for a long time too, and the timing just didn't work out. And Kellan said, "Hey, what do you think? What do you think of Cam? Should I hire him?" I was like, "Oh, yes, you should. He's great, really good. He's going to do great things for your firm."
Yeah, that's actually not that dissimilar with how our phone call went.
Yeah, no, it was exactly like that. I was really mad, but he was going to do a great job for Kellan, and of course he has. And just to succinctly underline his original point, develop a proprietary set of relationships or a track record. That's why you get hired into venture, are those two things.
Bring us deals.
Be able to do that, you'll be in good with everybody, right? David, what do we have next on the list? I think we got a few more minutes here.
We do. We have a few more minutes and we have just a few more questions. This one is from Peter. He says, work from home is reality, especially for software developers and people in tech. But what about for companies that manufacture goods?
So is the question more of where do we think that's going?
Correct. Where is it going and what happens next for them?
Any thoughts on that? Go ahead, Heather.
I can speak to that just because we do have some hardware in our portfolio, and it is, no doubt a problem. I mean, one of my favorite companies is a smart shopping cart company, and it's a giant pain for them to have to ship shopping carts around between their various home offices right now. That's not fun. But no, manufacturing's, so smart. And so they have adapted really rapidly to this pandemic environment, and automation, just like we're manufacturing pizzas, that's hard compared to a lot of other things that can be manufactured with using automation. So I think manufacturing is going to be just fine. And certainly we're seeing more activity in 3D printing and other sort of hacks to the traditional manufacturing process. It's just a question of looking at the longer term consumer trends. What do we need manufactured? We're seeing a lot of activity in reuse and the shared economy. That's one of the things that's driving Vouched for Vouch, for example, that Mike highlighted. I would not be worried about manufacturing and would look more to where can it be done effectively and how can technology be brought to bear to make it more efficient over time.
David, what do we have next in the queue?
Yeah, second to last one in the queue. With the IPO market going gangbusters, how has that affected valuations in the seed rounds? We've already talked about that, but the second part of this question is very interesting. How will the VC world react in our panelists' opinions if there's a pullback similar to what happened in 2000, for those who may remember 2000?
The IPO markets are so irrelevant to the seed world or the pre-seed world. There's 10 years before those companies, or 8 to 10 years, whatever the length of time is, for those companies are going public. And so, I lean on the other panelists, but I haven't seen much change with the IPO markets that impact seed investing valuations at all. It's just so disconnected.
I would say, though, along these lines, there's a lot of capital in the system. Deals are getting done. As you get kind of A stage and beyond, if you have an inflated valuation and the numbers aren't consistent with the value, you could see as if there is a crunch in the later rounds, you could see an impact there. I think founders got to be smart around the valuation, how quickly they spend the money. I think they need to be real thoughtful and intentional about that as we head into this new year.
Okay, last question, David, and then I see one more that just got popped into the chat there.
Yeah, actually, that's a comment thanking everybody and saying what a great session it was. Unless something just popped in the last few seconds from that. JJ has a two-part question. I'm only going to ask the second part because we've answered the first part. But the second part of it is, do you anticipate more funds forming at the early stage? Curious to know what you are seeing as investors. And I think this ties in real nicely to the previous discussion that there isn't a lot of seed funds and a lot of angel investors in the Puget Sound region.
The problem is that I don't see the constituent parts that would feed into that I saw in the Bay Area maybe 5 years ago. So there's this micro seed phenomenon that kind of kicked off in the Bay Area where, basically there was kind of two profiles. There was people who started at a big firm and then said, hey, I don't like this. I want to do something smaller. And then they would go and they'd raise their own smaller fund, and maybe some of their GPs would invest, or some of their former founders, or whatever it was, or the kind of founder, former founder, former executives, they would raise a micro seed fund, and there was kind of a playbook of people moving from either big funds into seed funds or angel investors into seed funds, and that's usually what we see. The problem in our ecosystem is that there's just so few angel investors here that are developing the track record, that are developing, those relationships and deal flow syndicate relationships that I don't see like a flood of funds coming in. Now, there are people who have taken that path and done it successfully. Somebody that should be on this panel is Kirby Winfield, who's a friend to I'm sure all of us, and is much beloved in the Seattle ecosystem. And that's kind of how he did it. He was a founder, started angel investing, and then ended up doing seed investing. And I'd love to see 15 more Kirbys in 2021. I just don't see a ton of people on that path. I know of a few, but not enough.
Heather, it looked like you were going to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I would kind of put our team in that category, and part of our purpose in starting the Flying Fish was to prove it could be done and encourage other people to do it. I agree with, now having done it, I would say I agree with James. It's really, really hard, and you have to be doing it for reasons that are complicated and multiple. Because it's not the easiest path for sure. And then the other thing that we need to see is more spin outs. I mean, Pioneer Square Labs, who could also be on this panel, they were really, in many ways a spin out of Madrona. And so, we need to see more of that. And we're such a polite and loyal town that a lot of times people don't sort of break off and do their own thing. But we need to see more of that. And of course, John Stanton's, James is so confusing. Who are, help to Kellan in getting going with Fuse, also awesome. So just more of that, more giving back, more, courage. And I think we do have a number of people that are trying to start funds, and, hopefully they'll be successful. And certainly there is an ecosystem of people who have done it, who are encouraging others, and all of us have participated in that. So knock on wood, 2021, we'll see maybe a couple more funds, at least in the beginning stages, and we'll just grow from there.
I'm going to ask for one more comment from each one of our panelists before we turn this back over to David and to Helen. And this is, I just want everybody to give this to me in 30 seconds or less. A pro tip for founders raising money. So I know that there's some that are in the audience. So if you could just give me a very succinct 30 seconds. Kellan, I'm going to start with you. What's a pro tip?
Especially in the time of Zoom, really work hard on the story, because the sizzle really matters. And then also really understand the quality of the introduction that gets you there, because we are really indexing more on close connections and referenceability than ever before. And so the quality of the introduction matters, because VCs will say, how was I so lucky to get in front of something like this? And so if it's someone that's made money for the VC in the past, or someone that they deeply trust, go that route.
Mike, add to that.
Yeah, I would just say avoid spray and pray. I mean, focus on the top 10 to 15 investors who are investing in your domain. Do what Kellan said, get the right introductions, write the right email that's customized and very specific to the investor. I think you're going to have better success that way.
James, what can you give to folks?
Start before your fundraise. Investors want to see momentum, trajectory, and progress. And it's much easier to underwrite those things in an investment. If somebody can come back to you and say, hey, remember when we did that 30-minute quick chat and I told you what I was going to do? I did that and more. Here's where we are. Holy smokes. Well, now I know you can execute. Do I like the story? Do I like the market? Now we can go.
I love it. Helen, where did I come up with that? Heather, goodness gracious. Now I'm calling people names. Heather,
it's an H.
Wrap it up.
We'll let you slide. As long as you're not confusing me with James, I'm okay. So everybody's comments were excellent. The only thing I would add, and this has just been coming up for me in the last couple of pitches, is you've got to have more points of interaction. So in addition to the excellent points everybody else made about the referenceability and the traction and all of that, if you are not coming through in that Zoom, you need to get on the phone and talk to the investor. You need to make your personality, your conviction, your chops come through. And so you may need to interact more in order to really make that sing, particularly if there are multiple founders, because two of them may be relatively quiet in the pitches. And so you've got to figure out a way to get those founders to the fore as well.
Very good. I think that is excellent advice. Heather, I hope that that's your husband behind you. Otherwise, there's a stranger walking behind you in your house, and we should send
No, that's
somebody.
part of my networking campaign. It's all good.
Excellent. Perfect. Well, with that, David, I'm going to turn it back over to you and to Helen to wrap this up.
Thank you, Jen. On behalf of TalentReach, I would like to thank everybody for attending. I know that Helen, Jeff, Eric, and the entire team appreciates you joining today. If you have hiring needs for sales or tech talent, I know that the folks at TalentReach would really enjoy to have that conversation with you and work on earning your trust. This concludes our webinar for the day. The webinar will be available for replay. All registered attendees will receive an email probably by the end of the week. That will give them access to that. Stay tuned for the next TalentReach webinar that will happen sometime in early 2021. And one day we look forward to doing this actually in person to close with optimism. I would like to thank Kellan, Heather, Mike, and James for their participation today. And with that, we're going to say goodbye. Once again, I am David Obelts with the Badon Hill Group. We're a marketing agency that brings big business marketing to companies of all sizes. Thank you and have a wonderful day.